in such a crazy world right now, that people need to feel appreciated, and they also need to know that their employers empathize with their situation, because you got working parents, you have people that are, struggling with illness, and it's a totally different way to operate. And so obviously the culture is going to shift a little bit now, but I think, again, employees want a culture of empathy right now.
You don't really know who you are or what you are until you put a really big challenge in front of you.
Fear is an asset and ally here to help you be magnificent.
This crazy, silly, stupid idea to run across the Sahara Desert.
You did make it this time, but you said if you didn't make it, you would try again and again.
Everybody's connected to nature, connected to music, to their families, and now we're going to build a world that doesn't have racism and war and starving kids.
I kept telling myself, run at me, and just keep smiling.
All right, Rocco, thanks for joining me today. We are recording.
We are. I'm on the other side of it. It's very strange.
Excellent. Yep. So let's just start us off, as I like to start every podcast, which I do with walking or running. If you could just introduce yourself and let people know who are hopefully walking or running along with us where you are right now and where you are taking a walk at the moment.
Sure. So my name is Rocco Lungariello, and I am the host of the podcast, What is Culture?, that I host for my company, Tangoe. And I am outside in Shelton, Connecticut at one of those recreational parks where kids play like Little League and football. And I think there's like a play, I'm pretty sure there's a preschool or something going on behind me where there's kids out. So to be honest with the people listening, when I first got the invite to do this on a walk, which is kind of the premise of the extra mile, I was like, that sounds awesome. But then the sooner that the date came, I got a little bit nervous, and I'm like, wait, I need notes in front of me. I need my computer screen. But then I had to psych myself up, but I'm out taking a walk. It's seriously like one of those perfect autumn days. It's like 72 degrees with a light breeze. But yeah, I love it. So thanks for having me on. Awesome. I'm excited to talk about culture, and this is just very exciting.
Yeah, so you mentioned that, you're usually on the other side of this, and you said that you have your own podcast, What is Culture, which is kind of what I wanted to chat with you about today. I thought it's very interesting that, so you work for a company called Tangoe, and for those out there, Tangoe is one of our newest partners in our employee empowerment program with Charity Miles. So I've gotten to know the folks at Tangoe, and when they told me that they had their own podcast, What is Culture? I was like, that is very unusual for a company to have its own podcast about company culture. Yeah. And I just think that that's extraordinary. And I hope that you could share a little bit more with the listeners what that is about and why, maybe even start with like, what is Tangoe and what does Tangoe do? And then also like, why do they have a podcast, What is Culture? And then maybe we can get a little bit deeper into like, what you've learned about company culture. Because the people out there listening, Rocco, some of them might be in the HR departments at their company, but a lot of them out there work for companies, and, probably culture just, comes from within too. So we're all going through like a strange time at our jobs right now where company culture is taking on kind of a new meaning, and we all have responsibility for that in our own ways at the companies that we work for. So just very interesting to share like, what company culture is and how we can each play a part in shaping our company culture and trying to make our companies healthier and happier places to work. So with that kind of preamble, I'll kind of leave it to you to like share like, a little bit more about what Tangoe is and and about the podcast, What is Culture?
Yeah. Okay. Like I said, this is interesting because it's not often that I get to even talk about this stuff. You know, it's like I've just been going at it since February of 2019. So we're 70 episodes in, just to put that out there. So Tango, that's a tough question. Just it's like a complicated industry that we're in. So I'll try to exactly Tango it. So at a very high level, we are like a software and services provider of technology expense management. And we essentially work with enterprises, and we give them like a holistic view of their mobile, fixed, and cloud spending. And our people and our technology work with these businesses to help them work smarter, and essentially save money. And so that's might be a little bit kind of unclear or tough to follow, but I encourage you to visit Tango.
Yeah,
I encourage you to
people
visit,
should check out Tangoe.com to like
Tangoe.com.
see if that's the type. But the reason I think that it's interesting to like start with that is that you're not like an HR company. You're not like a culture. You're not the type of company that's going around helping other companies build culture or to think about human resources issues in that way. You're like an IT company almost, if I understand, right? Like you said, a lot of things that I hardly even understand. So you're like,
I don't know.
You could be anybody. You could be anybody's company, right? Like anybody listening to this could be working for Tango. You know, you could, you know, the issues that when you think about company culture, it's not like you're thinking about it from, you know, a perspective that wouldn't apply to like an accounting firm or a law firm or a software company or a manufacturing company. Like you're a company and you do, I'm sure, you know, you guys do great work in your field, but it's not like you're a culture company, yet you have this, obviously this emphasis on company culture to the point where you've even created your own podcast about company culture. So I thought it was just really interesting to start with that, because the things that I'm sure you've learned could just apply for any company.
Yeah. So and kind of the origin of the podcast is interesting and probably worth sharing too. Is so I was hired as their content marketing manager about 2 years ago, and I was writing an executive blog for the CEO. Basically, I was ghostwriting a blog for him, and so he invited me to come and meet him about 2 or 3 months into working at Tango. He's like, you know what, why don't you come meet me? You'll get a better understanding of what kind of person I am, and it'll help you write the blog. And I said, cool, sounds good. One day in of shadowing him, we started talking about culture and what that means and why it's important, and talking about, well, how can we work to nurture it, discover it, improve it? And I threw out the idea of a podcast, not thinking in a million years that he would go with it, because about 3 or 4 years ago prior, I did a podcast on my own for like my personal enjoyment. And so I had some experience, and he's like, absolutely, let's do it. Let's go for it. And I was like, holy crap, we're really going to do this. And to make it even more frightening, he said, let's make it external facing. So a lot of people, when I say I host a podcast for Tango, after I tell them what Tango is, they're like, they assume that it's internal, but anyone can access this podcast.
Right.
And the idea is we have nothing to hide. We are who we are. Our history is our history. Our people are our people. That's not our concern. Our concern is let's have meaningful conversations with our employees about what culture means to them. And by doing that, you're discovering your own culture, because we have almost 2,000 people in close to 10 countries. And the more I learn about culture, the more it varies from everybody, every person, every department, every country. And so we just opened it up and went for it. And basically, like, always kept forward thinking. Like, I'm scared. Every time I published an episode, I was scared. Seriously, because I'm like, what am I doing? How is this even happening? My wife was like 8 months pregnant, and I called her from the hotel room because I was shadowing the CEO in New Jersey. And I'm like, hey, hey, Shannon, the CEO wants me to do a podcast. She's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what do you mean? And I'm like, I don't know. And so I don't know how I overcame the fear. I leaned on a lot of employees, a lot of colleagues, but I knew that what we were doing was important.
Yep.
And I knew that I had to do it, but we, a lot of cliches like airing your dirty laundry, like we talk about, nothing is censored. I mean, anybody could come on our podcast and talk about whatever they feel. So I always kind of got a little bit nervous, but I always had the guidance of the executive team that was like, don't worry about it. Nobody reviewed it. I published it. I sent it out, and it was the only way to show our people that this was genuine. And
right.
Here we are almost 2 years later.
That's awesome.
I can't believe we did it, but yeah.
Who are the types of people that you have on the
It's a
podcast?
lot, right?
I mean, other than me, I was on the podcast a few weeks ago. Like, who are they? Mostly Tangoe employees? Do you have Tangoe customers? Other Tangoe partners? Like, who are the types of people that you get to be on the podcast?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've done 70 episodes, and at this point, about 14 of those episodes have been non-Tangoe employees. And so we had a few vendors, some clients, but then we started bringing in like people in the industry. Like I talked to industrial organizational psychologists, professors. I talked to people who work for, companies like Culture IQ based out of New York City. I talked to people where they kind of studied this and brought them in to get a perspective, to keep it more relevant to just, like you said in the beginning, it's like a secondary audience of this podcast is literally any company that is interested in company culture. And so it almost seemed natural to go outside of Tangoe. Yeah.
I find that to be really interesting because, you mentioned that you were basically like the content marketing guy at Tangoe. And for those out there that don't know content marketing is basically the idea that like a company in like the B2B space or the B2C space, but like you'll put out content that's relevant to your industry. Other people, potential customers might see that content, read it, you're developing your authority, and then, they'll want to like reach out to you and they could potentially become a customer. So like usually like a company, in the IT space, or you might put out like a white paper about, top 10 things that you should know about your server infrastructure or something. And then that would go, be interesting for people who are interested in that type of thing, and they might become your customer. But here, you're doing something about company culture, which really isn't necessarily related to your work as an IT company. Does this have like the content marketing effect where people listen to this and they become like aware of you and interested in you as a company, and then, it helps your business from like a content marketing point of view? It's not something it's so interesting.
Yeah. It is. It's really interesting. So I remember we call them town halls, but they're basically just company updates given by the executive team. And about 6 months into our podcast journey, the CEO gets on the town hall and he said, everyone's listening. And he said, what do you think is the number one question that customers and clients ask us when we get to a meeting? And people, threw out their typical answers, and none of them were right. And he goes, you're never going to believe it, but they always ask about the podcast. It's the first thing. They can't believe we're doing it. Why did we decide to do it? How is it? So, of course, I think indirectly that any one of our potential and even current clients, when they hear about this, it intrigues them. And it sparks a conversation about culture, about people. And that, essentially, no matter where you are, any company is just a collection of people coming together. And so I think it just opened our eyes up to just how valuable and how important it was that companies, our clients, wanted to work with a partner that had the same values, had similar points of views. And so, and also from the recruitment point of view, the I'm pretty close with our HR team. They say one of the number one things that they're asked by a prospective client is, what's the culture like at Tango? And what they do is they shoot them the link to the podcast, and they say, this is our culture. Go look at this, 90 some guests that have been on. I mean, and it's a tool that is used very, very frequently from the recruitment point of view, that when I talk to a new hire, pretty often that they are aware of the podcast and they've listened to an episode that maybe featured their current boss. So it's just become a big tool that kind of a lot of people in the company are utilizing.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm, from the hiring standpoint, like the employee happiness and engagement standpoint, it totally makes sense. And like when we started doing the employee empowerment thing, I would start reading a lot about, employee engagement and company culture and wellness and things like that. So I could see like the podcast being like, a clear and obvious fit for that. But one of the things that was surprising to me about it was what you said, how it could also, from like a sales and marketing standpoint, your potential clients want to work with a company that shares its values and a company that has a good company culture. So that is very interesting to me. I think that's something worth kind of just recognizing for a moment. But then from the employee side, which, like I said, might be a little bit more obvious, what have you learned about company culture from within that, over, like you said, was it 70 episodes or 90 episodes? Did you say 70 episodes? 70
yeah.
episodes. Like, what have you learned about company culture over 70 episodes of doing this podcast?
Yeah. Oh my God. So it's interesting because there's all these definitions about culture that,
Right.
I don't need to tell you because everyone kind of knows that, but
well,
I
actually,
think
yeah, in the
culture-
episode that we did, sorry to interrupt, you asked me, I think the last question that you asked me when I was a guest on your podcast was, what is culture? So maybe I should just start and ask you the same question. What, with all that you've learned, how would you define culture?
Oh God. Yeah. Well, and to remind those people who didn't hear your episode, you said it's how people walk through life. Is essentially that was kind of how you defined it, which I loved, and I got some feedback that people appreciated that too. Okay. Yeah, and it's funny because I figured that question would be asked, and I don't think I could prepare to answer it. And in a lot of ways, it's just because it, and it sounds kind of cheesy to say, but I think that culture is like a living organism, and depending on what day you ask me, I might have a different answer. And I've been doing this podcast for so long. Every department in every country and every person and depending on what particular field that they're in, I'm going to get a different answer to that question. But I think still, with that being said, for me, based on what my experience in all these interviews that I've done, I feel like you could tie it down to saying that culture is a collective dominant behavior of the organization. And so what that really means is, what is it like to work at your company? What does it feel like? How it is really?
Does culture come?
Having the opportunity.
Sorry, does culture come from the top, or does culture come from the bottom, from each individual employee, or both? And to what extent from either?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think when you're talking about nurturing, or influencing or even changing culture, then that has to come from the top down. But the culture as it stands, there's too many variables. Everybody has contributed to it. It is what it is now. And so that it's almost worth going back to the origin of the podcast, just to remind, or just so people have some backstory again, is we decided specifically to do this podcast after Tango acquired a company based in Indianapolis, who was essentially one of our competitors. And so they're a small organization, less than 300 employees. They were in business maybe 10 years about, and they were known for their just great culture. They had this kind of like family atmosphere. It was like Silicon Valley type of culture, right? And so when we acquired them, Tango was an opportunity for us to say, okay, we're acquiring this company. What can we do to make these people feel welcomed into the organization? And also, since everyone keeps telling us how great Moby culture is, why don't we take a moment to discover our own culture collectively? And so we let them, it was almost like it was an opportunity for us to pause and really reflect and discover our culture, because we knew how important it was that if we were going to have a successful acquisition and merger of these two companies, our cultures had to mesh. So that was kind of the reason why we decided to, at that time, that was when to do the podcast. So that kind of played a big part in it as well.
I guess I'll focus on like the bottom up side of culture, or because I don't know. I mean, some of the people listening to this may be, executives at their company and in a position to kind of implement culture from more of a top-down perspective. But assuming that more of the people listening to this podcast are maybe not at the top of their company, and maybe in more of a position to implement, and influence culture from within, what are some of the things that people can do that you have learned to help create and influence more of a healthy culture from within their own company?
Yeah, that's something that we're continuously working on. And I think the first kind of thing that any company could do is create culture committees, which is what we've done and we have adopted from our Indianapolis location after we acquired Moby in 2018. And because we have offices all over the place, we decided to create culture committees for every physical location. And it's essentially made up of, sometimes we call them culture champions, but it's people who have a passion for culture, people who have a passion for improving the employee experience at work. And so these people are like, have their ears on the ground and help the executive team get a better understanding of the culture at every location. And then we kind of meet frequently and discuss, what's the vibe like? What activities are you doing now to encourage engagement? What's working? What isn't? And we use these people, like I said, to kind of shrink our company because it is so big and it is across so many locations that you need champions. You need people at the bottom level, we'll call it, to be working towards getting people rallied together, getting people to engage, getting people to participate. And a lot of times it's more effective when you have people at the kind of employee level doing that champion for you.
And then within those committees, like what are the types of things that they are empowered to do? Is it just like, hey, whatever you think would be good for our culture, let's do it? Do they have certain parameters? Do they have like more free reign? Like how does that work?
Well, it's more about keeping culture top of mind, and it's less about like putting together activities and more about giving people a voice for real change. So it's not like a party committee planning. It's more like,
right.
Yeah, but that's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like. But it's really, I mean, how could I really have an understanding of 300 people in one location and also have an understanding of 400 people across, in India or China? unless we have, people representing that department, those areas for us and giving them a voice. So it's a place to address, to bring up concerns and ideas. And it's less about what can we do this week to have fun. It's more about having people feel empowered to share what their experience is really like and what we might be able to do to improve it.
So it's not like, that television show, The Office, where they have like the party committee and they're like, it's more like really centered in like, what are the values? What are our values and how do we express those values together as a company through the way that we treat each other, through our transparency, through the work that we do, and giving employees the voice to be able to have a say in what those values are and how the company expresses that. If I'm hearing you, I may be putting
you
words
are,
together,
and also,
but that's kind of what I'm hearing.
I think that's a fair assessment. It's also worth mentioning that I think people feel more comfortable not going to, their boss directly and not going to the executive team. But if they're in a focus group kind of atmosphere, like the culture committees kind of are really like a focus group, they feel empowered to be honest about, hey, there's a lot of people who feel really overworked. There's a lot of people who are really stressed out right now. And especially like all this stuff has been flipped upside down in the last 7 months with COVID, where I would say if you don't have a good handle on your employees' culture right now and the team and the way it is at your organization, it can get really tricky right now because a majority of our employees are working from home, and the dynamic has changed so much, but our culture committees are still active. We still are giving people a place to voice their concerns so that we can bring that up to executive and address, because culture, there's going to be times when things are really difficult. And I would say for a lot of companies right now, the morale could be not as high as you would like it to be right now. Yeah.
So what have you?
Podcast, it works in conjunction.
Right.
So yeah. No, I was just going to say that. So the podcast kind of works in conjunction with that, because not only do I host the show, but I also make it a point to reach out to as many people as I can and get an understanding of what their real experience is like and has been at Tangoe. And doing this for almost a year and a half, you start to develop a trust with your colleagues where they're willing to tell me how things really are at this particular moment. And so it helps us have those discussions on the podcast that address them. And it doesn't necessarily have to put that person on the spot. It's more just about awareness of the current situation that a lot of companies are experiencing right now.
What have you learned differently about either your culture at Tangoe or culture in general over the last 7 months?
It's a good one. I think a lot of people need empathy right now. They need a culture of empathy. And it's almost like it hurts if you're not told by your boss or your organization, hey, we understand that things are tough right now. I think that a lot of the employees now really appreciate when they have when they get the sense that their management understands the stressors right now, and that business as usual is kind of doesn't exist, and people need to people are going to thrive in a culture where it doesn't matter where you work. It's just a matter of trust and knowing I'll do my job every day. Maybe I just need the flexibility of my schedule being, kind of more on my terms, but we're in such a crazy world right now that people need to feel appreciated, and they also need to know that their employers empathize with their situation, because you got working parents, you have people that are, struggling with illness, and it's a totally different way to operate. And so obviously the culture is going to shift a little bit now, but I think, again, employees want a culture of empathy right now.
When you say right now, was it not that before, or did it take this experience for us to understand that this was important all along? That those are values that are important all along, and hopefully would continue after we, this COVID is hopefully one day over with.
I didn't think about that until you asked that question. I think for a lot of us, COVID kind of put a spotlight on a lot of things. Inequality, for one. It's put a spotlight on a lot of things in our workplace. A lot of companies had to make tough decisions, and make tough decisions to save money, and so people might feel a little bit more overworked than they have in the past. But I think, again, I'm thinking about it now that you asked us such a good question, but yeah, I think empathy is always something that employees wanted. And I think now, where we're so vulnerable, we want it more than ever. And a lot of people are looking for resources for mental health. They're looking for resources on time management, how to deal with this world that we're in. And so I think the answer to your question is, it is something we've needed all along. And maybe now it's just been, the spotlight has been put on it. And that's really, really interesting, because I didn't really make that connection, I don't think.
You also mentioned, I want to kind of come back to like resources and that in a second, but you also mentioned the importance of making employees feel appreciated. And obviously, that comes down, it's important for, that to come from the top down, so to speak, but also to come from within and within your own colleagues to make each other feel appreciated. You and I think when we last spoke, we have a mutual love of The Sopranos. And so much in that show, when you like watch it, for those who are Sopranos fans, comes down to different people in the Sopranos crew not feeling appreciated. Christopher always feels like Tony doesn't appreciate him.
Yeah.
Everybody doesn't feel like Junior doesn't feel appreciated. And then somebody gets whacked because of it. And so if you don't want someone in your organization to get whacked, or if you yourself don't want to get whacked, make sure that you let other people know how much you appreciate them. It goes a long way. If for no other reason than you don't want to get whacked. You talked about resources, making resources available. I just find this really interesting. Making something like mental health resources available to your employees. That comes up a lot, and I hear that a lot from companies and from people. That it's interesting to me because there's Google, right? Like, and if you need mental health resources, like if that's something that you as a person are interested in, like my first place, if I needed that, would be to go to Google and to find, what are the mental health resources near me, or there's tons of apps out there for it. Like, what place does a company have? And I'm asking this kind of rhetorically. What place does a company have in providing resources like mental health or gym, like wellness, for example? If employees want to get healthy and active, like there's a ton of apps and gyms and personal trainers out there. Like what role is it for a company to make those resources available when I can just like literally walk out my door and either walk or drive to a gym if I want to get healthy, or sign up for a 5K if I want to run one? Like, why does a company feel that it's important to make those types of resources available to their employees?
I think because if you're not willing to invest in something that important, I guess it comes down to your value as an organization. But for me, and I just can't think of anything more important than your wellness and your mental health. And I don't think it's something that is up to the individual only. I think if you're really going to say that you care about your employees, and people go to work to make money, right? So they can take care of themselves and their family. Sometimes we kind of forget about that work is a place for us to kind of enjoy our life. And if you want your best Rocco to show up to Tangoe every day, if I'm not in the right mental place, you're not going to get the best Rocco. And sure, in a perfect world, you have 2,000 employees who are super insightful and are like, whoa, I really should go and take time out to take care of myself. But that's just, the world doesn't work that way. And sometimes we just need that reminder, and sometimes we need that support, and sometimes we need someone to tell us, it's okay to feel how you're feeling. And so the more we make it not a thing, the more we can allow people to feel how they feel, then you're going to get people who want to work at your company, and you're going to, potentially help somebody through a really tough time. And that is directly related to the kind of culture that you want your company to be. Again, it's about allowing your employees to thrive in a place where they could come and be who they really are. And I think right now you're kidding yourself if you think that people aren't having a tough time adjusting to this crazy way of living right now. So I think it's not, I don't know if it's the responsibility of the employee, but it's the right choice for an employer to say, mental health is important. I believe we should provide resources for our people because we care about them more than just as a number, as an employee number. It's Rocco, it's Gene. These are people that represent us. Let's take care of each other in more than just the traditional sense.
You mentioned numbers, and how being more than a number. And I think it's interesting because when we started the employee empowerment program, we were getting ready to kind of like roll that out to companies. We always had companies reaching out to us for it, but like we'd never really sold it. And everything that I read was like, you have to be able to, if you're selling into an HR department, you have to be able to show ROI. And you have to be able to show how investing in this is going to produce an ROI. And if they invest $1, they're going to get back $2. They're going to, this is about saving on healthcare costs. This is about increasing productivity. And, employees are going to be 10x more productive, which is going to make them, generate this much more money for their company. And I just had such a hard time figuring out how to show that to companies. And what's been interesting for me is that since we've kind of really rolled this out, no company has ever asked us about that. Like no company's ever been like, how do we, show ROI for this? And it really more is, we just want to show our employees that we appreciate them and give them, this resource to be, to encourage them to be more healthy and to show that we care as a company about different causes and show that we want to empower them for more causes. But I'm curious as to like, just the overall question of measurement when it comes to culture. Is that something that you even try to measure? Do you try to measure an ROI from that, or do you do it just because it's the right thing to do? Some combination of both?
Yeah. Well, and I first want to go back to the idea of, so we rolled out Charity Miles officially 2 weeks ago, and I've been kind of a champion along with Nate or Allie on our team,
Yep.
And
big shout out to
the feedback the feedback we've been getting pretty early on is just people are happy that we offered something like this. Like it means a lot that we're doing something that not only is it good for our well-being, but it's selfless, and we're contributing to a greater good. So that's just been a great spark in the last few days, and we've been excited to kind of roll it out together. But again, we have about 2,000 employees. We would love 2,000 employees to be actively engaged in using the Charity Miles app. We've done 70 episodes of the podcast. We would love that every employee listens to it, right? Ideally. But I think you can't be blind, because it's a tricky question, because you might be asking yourself, well, you need to know if it's working, right? But you also you can't let that hinder anything. You can't let that stop. So you have to keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing the podcast. I can't tell you how many times I thought, should we stop doing this? Is this the right time? And essentially, it has to be a constant. I'm most proud of the fact that we've all done it long enough where it's a thing. It's like part of our culture. In the beginning, it was like this weird kind of kooky thing that we were doing, but now it's part of our company. It's like it's just something we do. And so a lot of times people too early start to look for ROI. And so why don't you let the plant grow a little bit longer before you start measuring it, right? I mean, let's give people a few months, but a year before we get to worry about ROI, especially when we're talking about people and culture. So, but at the same time, we've sent out surveys, we've asked what people like about the podcast, what don't they? What's your ideal time or length of time? Who do you want to see on the podcast? And ask difficult questions like, do you like the show or do you not? And tell us why. And they're anonymous surveys. And so we've done that twice and I've made adjustments accordingly. So you have to do both, but you just can't be, you got to be patient. And like I said, people are often too quick to ask the question, well, what did this really do? And it's like, let's be more patient and just do what we think is right.
I like that. And actually, what you made me think of there when you talked about the survey is how it's a back and forth. Sometimes people can think of something like a podcast as like a broadcast. Like me, I'm sending my message out to you and there's no feedback coming back. But what I like most about a podcast and why all of our podcasts like yours are interviews is that they're conversational. So same thing with the survey, even adds more to that conversation that you're getting feedback from people. And, culture could be one way where somebody's dictating this is what our culture is. But if you want to create a culture of empathy is all about listening, because you can't understand if you don't listen. And so if your podcast is about listening and giving a voice to people within your company, if the other things that you do, whether it's surveys or otherwise within your company, are about giving the people within your company a voice, that to me is, I think, like probably the best way that you can create a culture of empathy, because you're listening to people, which is really what I love about doing a podcast is I get to listen to people like you and listen to people like our members. And that creates a culture from, in our case, within the Charity Miles community of empathy. And in your case, within Tangoe, a culture of empathy. So I think that really powerful. I just wanted to kind of connect some of those dots there. I guess as we kind of wrap up here, for one last kind of question to kind of tie this together, the people listening to this, what can they do in this time to help, from within, if they're not on a committee, maybe they are on a committee, they're not on a committee, what's like a simple thing that people can do within their own companies to influence their company culture for the better? And maybe to kind of be more specific about it with what we've been talking about, create more of a culture of empathy within their own companies.
I can't say enough about meeting in small groups, and it could be obviously virtual, where you gather, you get a random group of people together, whether they know each other or not, and you just start the conversation about culture and what it means. People are willing to share. People are willing to answer and talk about their experience within the organization. That might be a great place to start, is just to have those conversations on a small scale, led by, like I say, like a champion. And then, take kind of what you gathered from those small focus groups, put together a survey, and ask difficult questions, ask open-ended questions about, how people feel. Do they feel that they can be their true self at work? Ask the tough questions where you indirectly are asking about culture without asking about culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe I would add one thing to that, just to kind of like,
So, I mean,
just to like riff on that a little bit. It would be cool if you did it on a walk. Like if you said, hey, let's say that you were, that person and you wanted to lead that, like instead of sitting around a conference room table and talking about it, maybe you just all go out for a walk together and talk about it, which is, I find, and why I do the podcast. Maybe you have found it, this, like you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, you've never done a podcast on a walk before. I find that when you have a conversation on a walk, it's a totally different type of conversation than when you're sitting around a conference room table. And it might just kind of, even in itself, the act of walking, like everybody's moving in the same direction, your feet are moving in rhythm with each other. You're breathing in sync with each other. And the act of itself is an act of health, right? Like you're almost leading by example in that moment. So the act of walking in itself is creating and expressing a value of health. And for that culture, that could be a kind of a cool way for anybody within a company, whether you want to be a champion or you're going to find a champion or not. But like anybody within their own company, if they're looking to help influence their company for, to create a healthier, more empathetic culture, invite your colleagues to go out for a walk. Kind of the same thing with this podcast. I always used to record the podcast in person on a walk or run with people with my handheld recorder. And with COVID these days, you got to make the best out of it. We're using Zoom. You're out walking in Connecticut, and I'm walking in Madison Square Park, and we're just, making the most of the opportunity. I think we got a lot of really good stuff here. So maybe that's a kind of a good place to wrap it up.
I just want to say.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say one last thing about, we've been talking about kind of the importance of just being honest and being willing to talk about culture, to talk about, your experience at work. And it comes back to just connecting with people, and just you and I talking about this particular topic gets me thinking about how to approach things differently. And I think just having difficult conversations with people in general about any topic, it helps you become more insightful about, well, maybe I should think a little bit differently about how I approached it. So I just think it keeps us open-minded when we keep having difficult conversations.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this wasn't a difficult conversation. This was a pretty easy conversation for me, but actually we did a really interesting podcast with my old law school professor, Bob Bordone. We actually did 2 of them about the importance of having difficult conversations and how to have them. So I'll send those to you if you want to listen to them, maybe share them out. And for those of you listening who haven't listened to those, make sure you check them out. They're actually 2 of our most popular interviews that we've done, and people seem to like them a lot. But Rocco, real quick, just to kind of wrap it up for people out there listening, where can people find your podcast?
Yeah, thank you for that. So whatisculturepodcast.com there's actually a website for it, and it has all the episodes there. But obviously you could find What is Culture anywhere you listen to podcasts, but the most simplest place is to just hit that website.
Nice. Excellent. Really appreciate you taking the time to walk with me today and to share all of this with all of us. And really grateful to Tangoe for being part of the Charity Miles family and being part of our employee empowerment program. Big shout out to Nader Ali, who really spearheaded that. Talk about culture that grew from within the company. Nader taking the charge on that from within, and want to thank him for that, having that bubble up to the top. And I want to thank everybody out there for walking and running along with us today, putting up with a few kind of, cell reception issues. Maybe we'll be able to edit those out. We'll see. And Rocco, thank you again very much. Every mile matters.